Marcus Quay was 39 years old, and for 8 years he had let the world believe he was exactly what he appeared to be. A quiet logistics coordinator who drove a dented Silverado and packed his own lunch. He wore the same three jackets in rotation. He kept a joint account with $1,200 in it. His wife's friends called him Steady Old Marcus, and Renata never once corrected the gentle condescension in their voices, because it suited her to have a husband no one looked at twice. He came home early on a Thursday and saw the silver Maserati parked where his truck usually sat. Through the front window, he watched a tall man in a tailored gray suit pour wine into two glasses in Marcus's own kitchen, comfortable as a landlord. Renata laughed at something the man said, a laugh Marcus had not heard directed at himself in years. The man's name was Dorian Vale, and he managed a regional distribution branch, a branch that fell 4 levels up an ownership chart almost no one ever read, under a holding company called Quay Ardent Logistics. $2.4 million in personal assets sat in trusts Renata had never thought to look for, because she had spent 3 years building her quiet exit and never once asked the right question. What Dorian did not know, what Renata had never bothered to learn, was that the man she called boring had spent 12 years building the very structure that signed Dorian's paychecks. He came to that window expecting to feel rage. Instead, he felt the cold, clean focus of a man reading a load chart he already understood. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows Marcus had reframed himself 2 summers earlier, catching the grain of the oak countertop he'd sanded by hand. The coffee was still hot. He sat with the mug cradled in both palms, watching the steam rise the way he watched most things, patiently, without hurry, as if everything would explain itself if he simply waited long enough. He had laid the tile under his own feet, every piece leveled and set, grout lines straight as surveyor's marks. His grandmother had raised him in a house with crooked floors and a roof that wept in the rain, and she used to tell him, "A thing built right doesn't need to brag. It just stands." She had passed 4 years ago, and Marcus still heard her voice in the quiet hours, low and certain. Renata came down in a robe he didn't recognize, smelling of a perfume she hadn't mentioned buying. She kissed his cheek, a quick, dry thing, more habit than warmth, and asked if he'd be late again. He said he might be. She nodded, already looking at her phone, the screen tilted away from him at an angle he had started to notice without saying so. He remembered the woman she had been when they met. He'd been 29, running a small freight operation out of a leased warehouse. Sleeves rolled up, hands rough. She'd come in to interview for a dispatch job and asked sharper questions than anyone he'd hired in a year. They talked past closing. She laughed easily then, and meant it, and when he walked her to her car, she said she liked that he didn't try to seem like more than he was. He had married that laugh. He wasn't sure when it had become a tool she used on other people. By the time the business had grown into something with subsidiaries and a board and a name on a building, he had learned to keep the size of it quiet. Only his lawyer and his financial advisor knew the full shape of what he owned. He'd watched what money did to people. He preferred to let it do nothing at all where it could be seen. His other phone, the sleeker one, stayed in the inner pocket of his jacket where it had always lived, untouched and unknown to her. He finished the coffee and rinsed the mug and set it on the rack to dry. And as he reached for his keys, his work phone, the ordinary one, lit up with a text from a number Renata thought he didn't have. It was from her, sent to the wrong thread. "He's gone by 8. Come at 8:15. Marcus read it twice. He set the phone down on the counter, face up, and looked at it the way he'd look at a hairline crack in a load-bearing beam. Not with panic, but with the recognition that something would have to be done, carefully, and soon. He did not call out. He did not knock on the bedroom door. He picked up his keys, walked to his truck, and drove 3 blocks to the diner on Macklin where he'd taken his coffee for years. And there, in a corner booth, he opened his laptop. The message had come from Renata's secondary number, one he'd known about for months without mentioning it, the way you notice slow leak and decide to watch it before you tear open a wall. He forwarded the text to himself, then he screenshotted it, then he opened the document he'd quietly started keeping in March, a folder of dates and amounts, and he added a new line. His hands didn't shake. He scrolled back through the bank records he'd been pulling once a week since the winter. The withdrawals had started small, $400 here, $900 there, framed as groceries and house things. Then larger, $6,000 to a storage unit, $11,000 to an account in her maiden name, $34,000 over 11 months moved out in increments small enough to look like nothing if you weren't counting. Marcus had been counting since the day he found the storage receipt in a glove box. He cross-referenced the dates, the pattern lined up against a calendar of his own travel. Every transfer landed within a day of a trip he'd taken for work. She had been building this on the days she thought he wasn't watching. She had been building it for nearly 2 years. He pulled the property records next. The deed to the lake cabin, the one his grandmother's small inheritance had bought, the one he'd put in trust, Renata had recently met with a real estate agent about. Under the assumption it was a marital asset she could pressure into a settlement, she had no idea it had never been hers to touch. And then there was Dorian. Marcus typed the name into the company's internal directory on his other phone, and the man's full personnel file opened like a door. Regional distribution manager, 3 years with the branch, 2 flagged expense disputes, a signature on a vendor contract that didn't match the signature on his employment paperwork. Marcus looked at that mismatch for a long moment. He had built his company on the principle that the paperwork always told the truth eventually if you laid it out in the right order. He closed the laptop, he sat with the cold coffee a while, then he picked up his phone and made a single call. "Phyllis," he said quietly, "I think it's time you and I sat down." Phyllis Arden had been his attorney for 9 years, and she had a way of going still when something mattered, like a hawk that had spotted movement in tall grass. She read the folder he handed her, without a word. Page after page, the storage receipts, the bank trail, the deed records, the screenshot of the text. When she reached the end, she set it down and folded her hands. "She's not just leaving you," Phyllis said. "She's been preparing to take you for everything she thinks you have." She tapped the bank trail. "The problem for her is that she's been measuring the wrong building." She told him what the law allowed and what it didn't. The trust assets were untouchable. The incremental transfers, if framed as the dissipation of marital funds in anticipation of divorce, could be clawed back. The cabin was his, and the secondary account in her maiden name, the one she thought was invisible, was a paper trail with her own name signed across the top of it. "You don't have a problem," Phyllis said. "You have a record. Records win." That afternoon, he drove out to see his Uncle Cleve, who had taught him to load a truck before he was tall enough to reach the latch, and who had known Renata since the wedding. Cleve sat on his porch with a sweating glass of tea and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "I never said nothing," Cleve finally offered, "but a man came around here about a year back. Tall fellow, nice suit, asking neighborly questions about you. Asked what you really did for a living." Cleve squinted into the yard. "I told him you moved boxes. Figured that was your business to tell, not mine." Marcus nodded slowly. So Dorian had done his homework and gotten the answer Marcus had spent a decade cultivating. "Your grandmother," Cleve said, standing with a grunt, "used to say the loudest dog in the yard is the one most scared of the dark. You remember that when you sit across from these two." He clapped Marcus once on the shoulder. "Don't rush it. The truth keeps better than a lie." Back at the company, Marcus had his compliance officer, quietly, through proper channels, nothing he hadn't been entitled to do as the owner for years, pull the full audit on Dorian Vale's branch. What came back was a familiar shape to anyone who'd spent a career watching cargo manifests. Phantom vendors. Inflated freight invoices routed to a shell account, a forged signature authorizing payments that vanished. Dorian had been skimming the branch for the better part of 2 years, and the same instinct that made him comfortable in another man's kitchen had made him careless with another company's money. Marcus read the forensic summary twice. The man courting his wife and the man robbing his company were the same man, and neither version knew the floor he was standing on belonged to Marcus. That night he went home and ate dinner across from Renata. He asked about her day. She told a smooth story about errands and a friend's birthday. He listened and nodded and passed the salt when she asked for it, and did not let a single thing show on his face. Some things you don't say. You let them say themselves. 3 days later, Phyllis called and said the filings were ready, the assets were frozen, and the branch audit had been forwarded to the board. Everything was loaded. It only needed to be delivered. Marcus chose the restaurant on Del Mar, a quiet, well-run place with white tablecloths, and a chef who had worked for him for 6 years. Because Marcus owned the building and the lease and the name over the door, though no one at the table that evening knew it. He'd asked Renata to dinner to talk things through, and she'd agreed, expecting he was certain, to begin the soft negotiation of taking him apart. She arrived in a dress he'd never seen, and her face flickered when she saw Phyllis already seated, and flickered again when Dorian walked in 2 minutes later, because Renata had not known Marcus would invite him too. "Sit," Marcus said gently. "Both of you. There's a lot to go over." He laid the first folder on the table and opened it. The bank trail. He turned it so they could read it, and he spoke in the same even voice he used to walk a new driver through a route. $34,000, he said. "Over 11 months, always within a day of a trip I took." He set down the storage receipts, the deed, the screenshot of the text she'd sent to the wrong thread. Renata's hand had gone to her throat. He laid each page down, one at a time, unhurried, like a man dealing a hand he already knew would win. Dorian leaned back with a thin smile and tried to take the room. "This is a lot of theater for a man who drives a work truck," he said. "You can't afford the lawyer it'd take to fight what's coming." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he slid a second folder across the cloth. "Open it," he said. Dorian opened it. The audit, the phantom vendors, the forged signature, his own personnel file with the company name printed across the header. Marcus watched the man's face move through confidence, then confusion, then the slow, sinking arithmetic of a person realizing the floor was not where he'd thought. "Quay Ardent Logistics," Marcus said quietly. "You've worked for it 3 years, Dorian. You've been stealing from it for nearly 2. He let that sit. "My name is the Q." Renata started to speak, started to say his name, to call it a misunderstanding, to reach across the years for some softness she thought still lived in him. "Marcus, please, we can." No, it was Phyllis, not Marcus, and she said it like closing a ledger. "You sent the text, you signed the account, there's nothing here to discuss. There's only what's already done." Marcus stood. He buttoned his jacket, the ordinary one, and gathered the folders, leaving each of them a copy because that was the kind of thing he believed in, that people should have to read, in their own time, the exact shape of what they'd done. "I spent 12 years learning how to move heavy things without breaking them," he said. "You'd be surprised how much of that is just knowing what to put down and when." He looked at Renata and there was no heat in it, only a clean, level distance. "I'm not angry. I'm clear. Those are different things." He walked out past the host stand, past the chef who nodded at him, and into the evening air, and he did not look back. Behind him, the table sat silent, surrounded by paper that mapped, page by page, the precise dimensions of a thing they'd built against a man who knew how to read a blueprint. 8 months had passed like water. The new house sat at the end of a gravel road with a porch Marcus had rebuilt board by board, the wood still pale where he hadn't yet let it weather. He'd planted a row of tomatoes along the south fence, and that morning the first of them hung heavy and split-skinned, too ripe to wait. He picked one and ate it standing in the dirt, the juice running down his wrist, the sun not yet over the tree line. He'd taken the company public on one division and folded the recovered assets into a fund that trained young drivers and dispatchers out of neighborhoods like the one his grandmother had raised him in. 40-some men and women through the program in the first year alone. There was a woman now named Celeste, an architect who'd come to consult on a warehouse retrofit and had asked him better questions about load distribution than his own engineers. She didn't perform for him. She argued with him about beam ratios and laughed at her own stubbornness, and she was there that morning, reading on the porch with her feet tucked under her. Present, in the easy way of someone who didn't need to be the center of anything. Renata, he'd heard through a cousin, was working a desk at a property office 2 towns over, the divorce having left her with exactly what the law said she was owed, and not $1 more. Her mother had stopped returning her calls. Dorian had been terminated, indicted on the vendor fraud, and had taken a plea that sent him somewhere small and gray for a stretch of years. Last anyone knew, he'd relocated after, to a city where no one had heard of him. Marcus registered all of it the way he'd register weather in a town he no longer lived in. Then he let it go. He carried 2 cups of coffee out to the porch, and set one beside Celeste, and lowered himself into the chair he'd built, and watched the light come up over the trees he hadn't planted, but had decided to keep. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.